Hi, I'm Ashish, and I'm going to speak to you about my research on old growth grasslands. So, grassy biomes, which includes an array of ecosystems such as grasslands, savannas, and open canopy grassy woodlands, are found throughout the world. And these ecosystems, for example, the Cerrado of South America, the prairies of North America, the savannas with their iconic wildlife of Africa, and savannas of South Asia, like the grasslands seen in this picture, are pretty biodiverse ecosystems. This biodiversity in turn supports at least a billion people and is important in terms of ecosystem functioning. For example, grasslands store a huge deal of carbon in the soils and also are important in terms of water provisioning. Despite their biodiversity and their importance in ecosystem functioning, increasingly grasslands have been viewed as low conservation value, um, arrested successional stages, which are ought to become forests over time. So this is a diagram which is pretty commonly shown in a lot of ecology textbooks, which shows how secondary succession progresses from pioneer species stages, which are the initial years dominated by annuals and perennials, so typical grassy stages, which are slowly replaced by pines or softwood species. And all these processes are accompanied by a fire suppression regime. And then eventually, with fire suppression, you have a climax community as shown in the right. So, this implies that the climax community is the one which is worth conserving and which is old, and grasslands or the initial phases are just an arrested successional stage which are not of much conservation value. So this notion of grasslands being really quick to recover or being arrested successional stages has led to a large scale conversion of these old grasslands to other land use types. For example, uh, agriculture is one such land use type, which is largely derived from grasslands. Grasslands are also increasingly viewed as targets for tree plantation activities and also intensive land use types or uh, intensive land use disturbances like mining. So once these grasslands are used for these land use types, they are also often abandoned after this, and then they result into something like secondary grasslands, which superficially appear to be similar to old growth grasslands, but then differ in multiple ways, as we'll see later on. So it is only recently that ecologists have started to throw this concept out that grasslands can too be ancient like forests. So there is an emerging body of research supporting this, but yet it is still not widely accepted throughout the world. So people still think that grasslands are of low conservation value compared to forests, and then there is nothing wrong in converting them to, say, an agriculture field. Um, so, if old growth grasslands are indeed ancient, if they're actually old, we would expect to find the following two patterns. So, first, we would expect that old growth grasslands, because they have had a long period of time to assemble the species, they would have greater species richness than secondary grasslands or the grasslands which are newly formed after abandonment of, say, an agricultural field. So that's our hypothesis one. A second hypothesis is if old growth grasslands are destroyed, they would actually be slow to recover their lost diversity, uh, as opposed to a fast recovery as shown over here, which we would expect if they were early successional stages, which were quick to recover once destroyed. So If they are ancient, we would expect a slow trajectory like this. If not, we would expect a fast trajectory of recovery. So in this study, I performed a meta-analysis of 31 paired studies, which gave 92 time points to test out these two hypotheses. This covered 6 continents, and each study site had a paired study design. So each site had one plot which was old growth and another group of plots or a plot which was some form of secondary grassland. They also occupied a wide bioclimatic space, as you can see in this panel. And we found that secondary grasslands had 37% fewer species than old growth grasslands. So, which also means that they just had 63% of the diversity of old growth grasslands. So the figure on your left shows the 31 studies listed in this column according to the continents. And then each study has got their own value, which we calculated as the log response ratio. So we use this metric by calculating the natural logarithm of secondary grassland species richness. So the species richness which was there in secondary grasslands, and divide it by the species richness present in the old growth paired grassland. So all values of log response ratio less than 0 would indicate that old growth grasslands are indeed species rich than the secondary grasslands. All values greater than 0 would mean the secondary grasslands are more species rich than the old growth ones. So each study has this black box, which is the log response ratio for that study. And the size of the box corresponds to the weights associated with each study. And the weights were proportional to the variance. So inversely proportional to the variance, sorry. So greater the weight, smaller would the variance of the study be. And the red dotted vertical line is the mean log response ratio for all these studies, which is negative 0.46, which translates to a 37% fewer species in the secondary grassland. So values on the left of this zero line mean that old growth grasslands are richer. Values on the right of the zero line mean secondary grasslands are richer. And you can see only 2 of the 31 studies had values on the right side of this line. The average line was somewhere here, which is negative 0.46. So to test our second hypothesis, we extracted 92 unique time points from each study and plotted them based on the year. So the x-axis in this panel shows uh, the abandonment time or the secondary grassland age in a log on a log scale. And the y-axis again is the log response ratio. So again, values less than 0 would indicate old growth grasslands richer than secondary. Values greater than 0 would indicate secondary grasslands richer than old growth. And the 0 dashed line would be the species richness levels of the old growth grasslands. So we found that secondary grasslands on an average uh, are really slow to recover. So they might take centuries to millennia to recover the lost diversity. So this line shows a pretty slow recovery. And again, the data points over here are scaled in proportion to the weights of the studies, which are inversely proportional to the variance of each study. So the minimum recovery time needed for grasslands was about 160 years, but more likely it is projected to be about 1,000 years or more. So clearly, secondary grasslands are really slow to recover once destroyed. Uh, then we were also interested in looking at species composition. So till now, we spoke about species richness, but then what about the kinds of species in those secondary grasslands? So we extracted data from a subset of 10 studies out of the 31, which provided composition data. Um, and then tried to see how does that scale with the log response ratio. So on the x-axis is the log response ratio. So as the log response ratio approaches zero, which means as the differences in the species richness of secondary and old growth grasslands reduces, you have greater similarity of secondary grasslands to old growth grasslands. But this only comes up to 43% even when you have the exact same number of species as you had in the old growth one. So a complete recovery of species richness resulted in just about 43% of similarity in terms of composition to the old growth grasslands. So clearly recovery of species richness is relatively faster, and the recovery of composition would clearly take a lot more longer. Then we were also interested in looking at what kinds of species dominate secondary grassland. And then it turns out that secondary grasslands were dominated, or they predominantly had a lot of weedy or exotic or invasive or non-native species in the initial decades, which is like at least for the initial 30 to 100 years, and as relative to the old growth grasslands. So even if the species richness of some secondary grasslands was higher initially, this data shows that clearly the increased richness of secondary grasslands was in part also due to the preponderance of weedy species. So which species then are slow to recover? A literature review of all the 31 studies revealed that the species with following characteristics are actually of conservation concern, and they are slow to recover. So species which are long-lived perennial forbs with underground storage organs like this one, uh, Drimia species from Indian grasslands, having a bulbous storage organ below ground, or then C4 grasses like this one, which are also a prominent compositional, uh, prominent member of the composition of many old growth grasslands. Also, species with dispersal limitations, anti-dispersed species, or species with seeds which just fall down on the ground, gravitational modes, and largely species which are fire adapted and demand light, like this Liatris species from Texas. So species which prefer open canopied places, regular fires, and also species with reduced seed banks and clonal propagation, all of these were the ones which were missing from the secondary grasslands. So to summarize, grasslands like forests can also be ancient. So this is not something widely recognized, and we found evidence that this is indeed true. Old growth grasslands are actually biodiverse ecosystems, as opposed to what we are told about, that they are of low conservation value. They are slow to recover once destroyed, which implies that we must strive to preserve as much as old growth grasslands as possible. And it is high time that we replace the outdated linear succession models with models which incorporate fire and megafaunal herbivory as critical components of regulating grassland structure and function. And lastly, our results also imply that we should avoid uh, carbon focused policies that promote tree plantation on these biodiverse grasslands, because they not only destroy the biodiversity but also are harmful in terms of ecology, economy, and also ecosystem functions like water provisioning. So I'd like to thank my funders, uh, people who provided data, uh, clarified software functions for one of the softwares which I used, and also for the feedback on the manuscripts. Thank you.